The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room as my mother-in-law's perfectly manicured nail pointed in my direction. Her voice dipped in false sweetness carried across the Anderson family dining table. Lisa, dear, I'm sure you understand that this sort of vacation requires a certain refinement. Perhaps it would be better if you sat this one out. The air stilled 20 pairs of eyes swinging toward me, some filled with pity, others glinting with satisfaction. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might choke on the humiliation. The elaborate vacation plans that had consumed the last 40 minutes of conversation, every detail about the Royal Pearl Island resort in the Maldives, every boast about private beaches and helicopter tours suddenly twisted into a knife between my ribs. I had just learned I was being explicitly uninvited. My husband Oliver's hand found mine beneath the polished mahogany table, his palm pressed so firmly that I could feel his pulse hammering into me as if his body was screaming what his words could not yet. Above us, the chandelier scattered prismatic light across gleaming silverware and untouched glasses of wine. Only moments earlier, my mother-in-law had unfurled actual blueprints of the presidential villa she had reserved. Now I understood that villa was not meant for me. My name is Julia. I'm 32 years old, a former barista who once thought love was enough to survive any storm. Tonight I was learning how cruelly wrong I had been. This is the story of how I turned a cruel exclusion into the most expensive lesson my mother-in-law would ever learn. Oliver broke the silence, his voice sharp, slicing through the tension. Mother, if Julia's not going, then I'm not going either. Gasps fluttered around the table. Paige's face hardened, every trace of feigned civility gone in an instant. Don't be ridiculous, Oliver. The entire family will be there. Your cousins are flying in from Europe. You cannot miss it because your wife isn't comfortable in luxury settings. Her words stung not because they were true, but because they were the precise weapon she knew would wound me. Vanessa, Oliver's sister, swirled her wine lazily before chiming in. She's right. Julia would feel out of place. Remember how overwhelmed she looked at the yacht club last summer? She didn't mention the champagne she had spilled on my dress that day, or how she had loudly offered to buy me something more appropriate while the other guests pretended not to notice. I placed a gentle hand on Oliver's arm. My voice was quiet but steady enough for everyone to hear. It's okay. You should go with your family. The triumphant gleam that flashed across Paige's eyes made my stomach churn. She believed she had won. She always did. From the very day Oliver introduced me as the coffee girl he had fallen in love with, she had vowed to peel me away from him piece by piece. I still remember those early days. The smell of roasted beans clinging to my clothes. The way Oliver walked into the cafe like no other customer I had ever seen, kind, genuine, smiling at me like I mattered. Not like a barista, but like a woman. When he asked for my number, I thought my life had just bloomed into a fairy tale. But Paige Anderson was not the villain of fairy tales. She was worse. She didn't just sneer, she calculated. She was not simply rich. She was the kind of wealthy that treated private jets as taxis, the kind of old money that thought dignity came with bloodlines. To her, I was a stain, something that coffee grounds could never quite wash away. For 3 years, I endured her barbed comments at family gatherings. Julia, dear, is that dress from a department store? How fascinating that you used to serve coffee. It must be so nice to never have to work again. Always spoken with a smile, always sharpened to cut. But what she didn't know, what not a single Anderson knew except Oliver, was that while I served coffee and studied late into the night, I had also been quietly investing. I wasn't just chasing a degree, I was chasing freedom. Cryptocurrency had been a whispered gamble back then. For me, it became a lifeline. I devoured everything. White papers, forums, predictions, and I took risks when others laughed. Over time, the risks multiplied into something bigger. My small beginnings snowballed into wealth that rivaled even the Anderson fortune. I chose silence. I chose to live simply, to let them believe their fiction about the coffee girl. Because I needed to know who saw me, Julia, not the balance in my accounts. Oliver was the only one I trusted with the truth. He respected my choice. He protected it. And he let me stand quietly in the shadow of my own making. But that night, as Paige flaunted her Royal Pearl Island plans, I was already moving pieces she could never see. Because 6 months earlier, when I overheard her bragging about wanting to book that resort, I had made inquiries of my own. The Royal Pearl Island Resort had been bleeding money. Its owners were desperate, and through a web of carefully disguised shell companies, I bought it all. Not just the villa, not just the resort, the entire island. And now, while Paige gloated, the email I had been waiting for finally arrived, acquisition complete. Royal Pearl Island is officially yours. Oliver glanced at me as we drove home that night. You're awfully quiet, he said. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my lips curving into a small, secret smile. Just thinking. He sighed, loosening his tie. I'm so sorry about my mother. I'll tell her tomorrow that we're both staying home. I reached for his hands. Actually, I think you should go. His eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Without you, no way. Trust me. I said, the plan crystallizing in my mind like glass forming from molten heat. I think it's time your mother learned that appearances can be deceiving. The next morning, the Anderson family boarded their private jet, blissfully unaware that the coffee girl they had dismissed was the one who controlled the ground beneath their feet. From my own modest home office, I opened my laptop. The resort's security feeds flickered onto the screen. Streams of pristine beaches, turquoise water, and the villas Paige thought she owned for 2 weeks. I leaned back, watching, waiting, knowing. Because the woman they had tried to exclude was no longer the barista at their mercy. I was the owner. And Paige was about to learn what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. The Andersons' jet touched down on the island runway just after sunrise, the horizon painted with streaks of pink and gold. From my laptop in Seattle, I watched the live feed as the family descended the steps, with practiced grandeur. Paige, in oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf, Oliver's father, trailing behind her with a drink already in hand. Vanessa clutching a designer tote as if paparazzi were watching. They looked so certain of their place, so assured of their dominance. The irony was sweet enough to sting. They were walking into a kingdom, but the crown no longer belonged to them. Oliver texted me as soon as he stepped off the plane. They're already complaining about the temperature on the tarmac. You'd think they were royalty. I smiled faintly, my fingers dancing over the keys. Just wait, royalty has a new queen. For a moment I paused, letting the words settle in my chest. The old me, the coffee girl, the invisible daughter-in-law, the woman who had swallowed every slight with a shaky smile, would never have dared write those words. But that woman was gone. By noon, the family had checked into the presidential villa, gushing over the sprawling infinity pool and floor-to-ceiling windows. Paige stood on the terrace, raising a glass of champagne as if she had personally conquered the island. Isn't it perfect, she said, her voice floating across the marble. Only the finest for the Andersons. Her entourage of siblings and cousins clinked their glasses, oblivious to the invisible strings I held. I could have laughed. Back in my office, I tapped into the resort's internal system, now mine to command. My face reflected faintly in the laptop screen, calm, poised, calculating. Not a barista anymore, not their scapegoat. The woman they dismissed was now orchestrating every breath of their stay. Oliver called me that evening, his voice hushed. She's bragging non-stop, telling everyone how hard it was to secure the presidential villa, how she had to call in favors. Let her, I said softly. The higher she climbs, the harder the fall will be. Still, when I hung up, a pang of guilt slipped into me. This was his family after all, his blood. And yet I couldn't ignore the fire that had been kindled inside me. Every insult, every humiliation, every time I had been treated like a stain at their polished table, it had all built to this moment. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring at the rain slicking the city streets. Is this revenge or survival, I wondered? Is it cruelty to give them back what they've fed me for years? Or is it justice? The questions lingered, but the answer always returned to the same place. I hadn't asked for this fight. They had drawn me into it with every exclusion, every whispered insult, and I had learned to fight in silence until the silence became my weapon. By the second day, the cracks began to show. Paige demanded a private boat for herself and Vanessa. I granted the request, but ensured the captain who greeted them was none other than one of my most loyal staff members, instructed to treat them not as royalty, but as paying guests. No groveling, no exceptions. When Paige's sharp tongue lashed out, the captain met her gaze coolly and said, "We're happy to accommodate within policy." She fumed, unused to boundaries. That night, Oliver called again, his voice carrying barely contained laughter. She threw a fit because the wine selection wasn't Anderson quality. I raised an eyebrow. Did she like the 2018 Bordeaux? He paused. Wait, you stocked that? Of course, I said, allowing myself a smile. I know her tastes better than she thinks. I also know how to remind her she's not as untouchable as she pretends, because while she sneered at my supposed lack of refinement, it was my signature on the invoices that supplied every bottle she sipped, every plate she tasted, every thread she lay her head on at night. On the third day, the family gathered for a beachfront dinner. The setting sun bathed the sky in fire waves lapping gently against the shore. Paige arrived in a flowing gown commanding attention as though she had orchestrated the scene herself. Imagine, she said, gesturing broadly to the horizon, owning something like this. The words hit me through the live feed, her fantasy colliding with my reality. I did own it. Every grain of sand beneath her heels, every wave brushing against her ankles. Oliver's gaze flicked toward the discreet security camera overhead. For a moment, I thought I saw his lips curve into the faintest smile. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My heart was pounding, not from anger this time, but from anticipation. The reveal was coming. The truth, like a tide, could not be held back forever. Still, I hesitated. A voice inside me whispered, "Is this who you want to be? The woman who humiliates her husband's mother even if she deserves it?" Another voice answered, sharper, louder, "No, I am the woman who refuses to be erased. The woman who endured their cruelty and chose to rise anyway." On the fourth day, fate handed me the perfect moment. Paige summoned the general manager, my general manager, demanding that the resort host an exclusive gala in her honor. "I want fireworks," she declared, "and only the finest guests. Everyone must know this island belongs to the Andersons." The GM bowed politely, masking his amusement, and said, "Of course, Mrs. Anderson. Everything will be arranged." When Oliver relayed the story to me, I felt the corner of my mouth curl into a smile. This was it. She had set the stage herself. All I had to do was walk onto it. For days I prepared. The invitations were sent under the guise of Paige's request, but the true unveiling would be mine. Staff were briefed, security was doubled, and a single banner was printed to hang above the gala entrance: Royal Pearl Island Resort, owned and operated by Julia Carter. The name she had tried to erase, the name she had mocked, the name she would never again forget. On the night of the gala, I boarded my own plane. My reflection stared back at me from the window, calm, unshaken, a woman stepping into her power. I wore not a designer gown, but a simple navy dress I had chosen myself, the kind that made me feel like me. As the island lights glittered below, my heart beat steady, strong. The time for silence was over, because tomorrow Paige Anderson would stand beneath my banner. And for the first time in her life, she would learn what it meant to be small. The night of the gala unfolded like something out of a dream. Though it wasn't Paige's dream, it was mine. The beach glowed under strings of lanterns, their golden light swaying in the soft ocean breeze. Tables lined the sand, dressed in ivory linens and crystal glasses that shimmered in the candlelight. A live quartet played just beyond the dunes, their music weaving a spell over the guests arriving in glittering gowns and tailored suits. And at the heart of it all was Paige Anderson, sweeping onto the scene in a gown of deep emerald silk, her diamonds catching the firelight. She moved with the poise of someone who believed the world belonged to her. With a wave of her hand, she summoned attention, as though every flicker of light existed only to frame her silhouette. From my vantage point, stepping quietly onto the resort grounds, I let the scene sink in. The last time I had been in Paige's presence, I was the coffee girl she humiliated, the outcast excluded from her perfect family vacation. Tonight, I was the owner of the very island she bragged about conquering. Oliver found me before anyone else did. His eyes widened with relief and then with admiration. "You actually came," he murmured, pulling me aside, his voice filled with a mixture of nerves and awe. I nodded, smoothing the fabric of my simple navy dress. "It's time." He looked at me as though seeing me anew, and for a moment I remembered the young man who had walked into the cafe all those years ago, who saw me not as a barista, but as a woman worth knowing. His hand found mine. "Whatever happens tonight, I'm proud of you." The words pierced me, softer than Paige's knives, but more potent, because they were what I had longed to hear from family and never received. I squeezed his hand once before stepping away. The gala began with laughter and champagne, the sound of glasses clinking against the backdrop of crashing waves. Paige stood at the center, commanding every conversation. "The Andersons know how to make an entrance," she declared, gesturing to the display around her. Her voice rang with ownership, as though the lanterns and the music had been conjured by her very will. Vanessa echoed her smugness, whispering loudly enough for others to hear. "It's a shame Julia isn't here. She would have been so overwhelmed by all this elegance." A ripple of laughter followed, sharp and cutting. My chest tightened, but not with shame, with anticipation. They were mocking me on land I owned under lights. I had paid for sipping wine from cellars I had stocked. The irony was almost too rich. The general manager approached the podium at the front of the gathering, his voice calm, his professionalism unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Royal Pearl Island Resort. Tonight we celebrate not only our honored guests, the Anderson family, but also the new future of this beloved resort." Paige lifted her chin proudly, already anticipating the praise. She had orchestrated this moment in her mind for weeks, believing herself to be the heroine of the story. The manager continued, "It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you the new owner and operator of Royal Pearl Island, Mrs. Julia Carter." The words hit the crowd like a lightning strike. The music faltered. Glasses stilled mid-air. Whispers exploded across the tables as every head turned toward me. Paige's face drained of color, the emerald of her gown suddenly harsh against her skin. What she whispered, though the word carried across the stunned silence. I stepped forward, my heels sinking softly into the sand, each step deliberate, each breath steady. The lantern light caught the edges of my hair and I lifted my chin, letting the moment settle into every corner of the gala. "Yes," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. "Welcome to my island." The words tasted electric on my tongue. Years of humiliation, years of being dismissed, years of swallowing every insult, they all crystallized into that one sentence. Paige stumbled forward, her mask cracking. This must be a mistake. You..." Her voice faltered, her composure unraveling in front of the very audience she had gathered to worship her. "It's no mistake," the manager said firmly, holding up a signed document. "Mrs. Carter purchased the resort months ago. Every villa, every grain of sand, every ocean wave, she is the rightful owner." The murmurs grew into a storm. Guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Paige and me. Oliver stood just behind me, his shoulders squared, his expression proud, as though he had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. Paige's hands trembled as she tried to gather herself. You can't possibly." "I can," I interrupted, my voice sharp but not cruel, and I did. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on the shore. The queen of her own illusions stripped bare in front of her subjects. For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke. Then Vanessa broke the silence with a half-laugh, brittle and shrill. "This is absurd. Julia couldn't afford something like this." I turned toward her, my eyes steady. "Maybe you should have asked instead of assumed, but then again, assuming was always easier for you." Gasps rippled through the crowd again, sharper this time. The weight of truth hung in the air, undeniable. Paige's face hardened, the fear twisting into fury. "You planned this. You wanted to humiliate me." I met her glare, my voice lowering but resonating with every syllable. "I didn't have to plan this, Paige. You did it to yourself. Every time you cut me down, every time you excluded me, every time you dismissed me as if I was nothing, you built this moment. I just decided not to hide anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the waves seemed to hold their breath. Paige's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. She stood frozen, her perfect facade collapsing piece by piece. I felt no joy in her unraveling, only clarity. Because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself, about showing her and everyone that I was never the small woman she painted me to be. I turned to the guests, lifting my chin. "Enjoy the evening. This resort belongs to all who choose to treat others with dignity. That is the only refinement I care about." Applause broke out, not thunderous but steady, certain. And in that sound I felt something uncoil inside me. For the first time I wasn't the coffee girl. I wasn't the outcast. I wasn't invisible. I was Julia Carter, and this was my island. The applause faded into the night air, mingling with the steady crash of the waves. Faces blurred together, some beaming with surprise, others whispering furiously behind their champagne glasses. But all of them were looking at me not as an afterthought, not with condescension, but with recognition. For a moment, It was intoxicating. Years of invisibility dissolved under the warmth of that spotlight. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I wasn't the girl who didn't belong. But even as I stood tall, my eyes found Paige. She was trembling, her hand gripping the edge of the table for balance. The emerald silk of her gown rippled in the ocean breeze, but her face was pale, drained of the regal mask she had worn like armor. Oliver stepped closer, his hand brushing my elbow. His voice was low, meant only for me. "You did it. She'll never treat you the same again." I swallowed my throat tight. That's not the point. Because even in triumph, there was no real joy. I didn't want her broken. I wanted her to finally see me, to look past her obsession with bloodlines and money and acknowledge me as her son's wife, as a woman worthy of standing at this table. Instead, Paige looked at me with a mixture of fear and fury, as though I had stolen something she believed was rightfully hers. The gala pressed on. Guests returned to their conversations, though now every word was colored by the revelation. I caught fragments as I walked past: admiration, disbelief, envy. She kept it hidden all this time. Imagine outmaneuvering Paige Anderson like that. Perhaps Julia was never the fool we thought. Each whisper slid into me like both balm and blade. Vindication, yes, but also the reminder of how low they had always placed me in their minds. Later that night, after the last of the music faded and the guests drifted to their villas, I found Paige standing alone on the terrace. The lanterns had dimmed, casting her in half shadow. She held an empty glass, staring out at the dark horizon. For a moment I simply watched her. This woman who had belittled me at every turn, who had tried to carve me out of her family's story, who had reveled in my exclusion. She looked small now, fragile in a way I had never seen. "Beautiful night," I said quietly, stepping beside her. She stiffened, her chin lifting. "You enjoyed yourself, didn't you?" I leaned against the railing, my eyes on the sea. It wasn't about enjoyment, it was about truth. Her laugh was hollow, bitter. "Truth. The truth is, you humiliated me in front of my entire family. You stripped me of my dignity." I turned to face her, my voice steady, but not cruel. "No, Paige. You did that to yourself. I didn't tell a single lie tonight. I didn't stage a performance. I simply stood in the light of what was already mine. You're the one who built your pride on pretending I was beneath you." Her hand trembled as she set the glass down. "You'll never understand what it's like, Julia. Being an Anderson means keeping control, keeping appearances, protecting the family name." "And what about protecting the people in the family?" I asked, my tone softening despite myself. "What about your son? What about me? Where was that protection when you were tearing me apart in front of strangers?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her silence louder than any defense. For the first time, I saw not just the tyrant she wanted to be, but the woman beneath it, terrified of losing control, terrified of being irrelevant, terrified of fading. And I wondered if all her cruelty had been armor for her own fear. "I never wanted to humiliate you, Paige," I said finally. "I wanted you to see me, to see that I wasn't some stain on your perfect story. I wanted your respect, that's all." Her eyes flicked toward me, glistening in the lantern light. For a heartbeat, something softened there. But then the steel returned, snapping shut like a trap. "Respect isn't given, it's taken. And tonight you took it by force. Don't expect me to thank you for it." I let out a breath, long and slow. "I'm not asking for thanks. I'm done asking for anything." With that, I left her on the terrace, swallowed by the sound of the waves. Back in my villa, the one that was technically mine in every legal sense, I sat by the window, staring out at the ocean. My reflection looked back at me, composed, victorious, but undeniably weary. Was this what revenge felt like? A hollow ache wrapped in fleeting triumph. Oliver came in quietly, his jacket slung over his arm. He sat beside me, his hand warm against mine. "You were incredible tonight," he said gently. I leaned my head against his shoulder, closing my eyes. "I don't feel incredible. I feel tired. Like I've been carrying this fight for years, and now that it's over, I don't know what's left." He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "What's left is us. No matter what she thinks, no matter how she reacts. You and me, that's the only family that matters." His words wrapped around me like a blanket, comforting, grounding. For so long I had let Paige's opinion define my worth. Tonight I had torn that definition apart, but in the quiet after the storm I realized Oliver was right. My life wasn't about proving myself to her. It was about living freely with him on my own terms. The next morning the family buzzed with whispers. Paige avoided me at breakfast, her fork scraping sharply against her plate. Vanessa barely met my eyes. But others, cousins, in-laws, distant relatives, came to me quietly offering smiles, congratulations, even respect. For the first time, I wasn't an outsider at the Anderson table. But acceptance didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would, because I no longer needed it. As I walked the beach later that day, the sun high and the sand warm beneath my feet, I realized something profound. The truest victory wasn't owning the resort. It wasn't humiliating Paige. It wasn't even being seen by those who had once dismissed me. The truest victory was knowing I no longer needed their validation. I stopped at the water's edge, the waves curling around my ankles, cool and refreshing. For years I had fought to belong to the Andersons. Tonight I understood I belonged to myself. And for the first time in my life that was enough. The days that followed the gala carried a strange quietness, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. Guests came and went from the resort, their chatter filled with speculation about me, about Paige, about the Andersons. For the first time in my life, whispers carried my name, not as a footnote, not as a joke, but as something weighty, undeniable. But inside, I felt both lighter and heavier all at once. I had won, yes. I had revealed the truth, and the world had seen me. But victory isn't always clean. Sometimes it leaves jagged edges you keep cutting yourself on, even after the fight is over. On the fifth morning, I sat alone on the veranda of my villa sipping coffee as the tide rolled in. The sun cast golden light across the water, the air thick with salt and promise. Oliver joined me, his hair tousled from sleep, his smile soft. "You're quiet," he said gently. I stirred my cup. I keep asking myself if I went too far. He leaned against the railing, his eyes on the horizon. "You told the truth. You didn't lie, you didn't scheme, you just stopped hiding. That's not cruelty, that's courage." I wanted to believe him, and maybe I did. But still, part of me ached. Not for Paige's humiliation, but for what might never change between us. Later that afternoon, I found her in the resort gardens, sitting alone beneath a palm tree. The woman who once dominated every room now looked like a shadow of herself, her posture stiff, her eyes distant. I approached slowly, the crunch of sand beneath my sandals the only sound. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "I suppose you came to enjoy the view of your victory," she said bitterly. I shook my head, lowering myself onto the bench opposite her. "No, I came to talk," she scoffed. "Talk about what you've already made your point. You're powerful, you're rich, you're not the coffee girl I thought you were. Congratulations." Her words cut, but not in the way she intended. They revealed her fear more than her disdain. "I don't need congratulations," I said quietly. "I needed you to see me. Not the money, not the resort. Me." Her eyes flickered, a crack in her armor. "And if I don't, then nothing changes," I said simply. "I'll go on living my life, loving your son, building my future. But know this, I won't shrink again, not for you, not for anyone." She fell silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For a long time, the only sound between us was the rustle of palm leaves and the crash of waves. Finally, she whispered, "You remind me of myself." The admission startled me. I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "When I married into this family, I wasn't accepted either. I fought for every ounce of respect I got. But instead of making it easier for you, I made you the enemy." The bitterness in her tone was laced with something else, regret. For a moment, I saw not the tyrant who had mocked me, but a woman shaped by the same wounds she had inflicted. A woman who had built armor so thick she couldn't tell the difference between protection and cruelty. "I didn't want to replace you," I said softly. "I just wanted to be part of this family." Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I don't know if I can give you that." I stood, brushing the sand from my dress. "Then don't. I don't need it anymore." And with that I left her under the palm tree, her figure small against the vastness of the ocean. That evening, Oliver and I walked the shoreline together, the moonlight painting silver paths across the waves. He held my hand tightly as if anchoring me to something steady. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No. Because for the first time, I don't feel invisible. I don't feel like I have to fight for scraps of respect. I finally know my worth." I know. He stopped turning me to face him, his eyes shining. And so do I. I always did. The wind whipped around us, carrying away the last remnants of doubt. When the Andersons finally left the island, Paige avoided my eyes. Vanessa looked at me with something that might have been fear or perhaps envy. But others, cousins, aunts, even Oliver's father, offered nods, handshakes, quiet acknowledgments. And for the first time, I didn't crave their approval. I didn't need it. Because I had something far more important. I had myself. Standing on the balcony of the villa after their departure, I watched the sun dip beneath the horizon. The waves whispered against the shore, each one a reminder that tides always turn. My story wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming the space I had always deserved, about refusing to be erased, about choosing dignity over silence. And maybe, just maybe, it was about reminding everyone, including myself, that sometimes the greatest power we hold is not the wealth we acquire or the battles we win, but the decision to stop needing validation from those who never wanted to give it. I took a deep breath, the salt air filling my lungs, and smiled. Because in the end, Paige's opinion no longer defined me. I did. If my story touched you, if you've ever been excluded, belittled, or underestimated by someone who was supposed to be family, let this be your reminder. Your worth is not determined by their acceptance. Your voice, your truth, your strength are yours alone. If this story resonated with you, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more heartfelt stories and leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear your story too. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't about bringing others down. It's about finally standing tall.